For millennia, the people of Ireland have sought to document their origins and justify their existence as a people. Whether in monastery huts or Victorian study halls, all manners of birthplaces were theorised, from mythological arrivals as the people of the Milesians to outlandish claims that the Irish were a lost tribe of Israel. These stories were usually shaped not by evidence as we know it today, but by the dominant narratives of their time.
But without further ado, let's get into it.
If we look to the Irish mythological cycle and wade carefully through the stories of battles and gods, we may find a bard's vision of the arrival of the Irish, or, as they are deemed, the Gaels. The medieval Irish text, called the Lebor Gabála Érenn, helps us set the stage for their arrival, and the story is as such. In the land we call Éru, there existed a fantastic and magical people known as the tribe of Danu, or the Tuatha De Danann, not mere mortals, but gods and goddesses. Not mere kings and warriors, but druids and heroes. They roamed all alone on the island for millennia, engaging in tales of triumph and battle among kin, while their druids studied the order of the universe. These gods were known for their victories over the previous stewards of Ireland, the Fir Bolg, and for victory over the chaotic forces of Ireland, known as the Folklore. But little did they know that on distant shores, in a land known as Hy-Brasil, other people were preparing themselves for a mighty and testing voyage in search of a new chapter. They were known as the Milesians, landing on the southwest coast of Ireland during the festival of Bealtaine. Their chief poet Archaeology chanted verses over the land. Eventually, they defeated the gods in a clash of the ages, and a treaty was formed between the two peoples. In return for freeing their crops from the gods' magic, the Milesians offered to divide the land in two. The gods would take the world below, within the ancient mounds, and the men the world above. And these men, down the centuries, would come to be known as the Gaels of Ireland. The tale of the Milesians provided Ireland with a powerful origin story. Yet as scholarship developed, historians began to ask a simple question. Could the arrival of the Irish be explained not by legend, but by archaeology? As historians began to move beyond myth and legend, new attempts were made to explain the origins of the Irish through scholarship rather than storytelling. One of the most influential came from the Irish linguist Thomas Francis O'Rahilly, who in his 1946 work, Early Irish History and Mythology, proposed that Ireland had experienced several waves of Celtic migration from the continent. According to O'Rahilly, groups such as the Cruachan, Érenn and Leighton, and finally the Gaels, arrived over many centuries, each bringing new languages and cultural traditions to the island. In this view, Ireland did not begin with a single heroic arrival, but with successive movements of Celtic peoples who gradually reshaped the land. For much of the 20th century, this migration model helped scholars organise the tangled threads of Irish legend, archaeology, and linguistics into a coherent narrative of settlement. Yet, not all historians were convinced that such invasions had ever taken place. Other scholars began to argue for a very different explanation. Rather than waves of Celtic migrants arriving from Central Europe, they suggested that Celtic culture may have developed gradually within the Atlantic world itself, spreading through trade networks and long-standing cultural exchange between Iberia, Britain, and Ireland. In this interpretation, Celtic identity was not imported suddenly through conquest, but formed slowly along Europe's western seaways over many millennia. So while earlier scholars imagined Ireland becoming a Celtic nation through migration, others argued that the culture may have emerged much closer to home. Both theories sought to explain the same mystery: how Ireland came to share language and traditions with the wider Celtic world. Yet despite these efforts to reconstruct the past through archaeology and linguistics, the search for Irish origins was far from settled. In fact, some thinkers would soon begin looking for answers in far stranger places. As the 19th century unfolded, attempts to explain the origins of the Irish took on a new appearance: the language of science. Across Britain and continental Europe, scholars began applying the tools of anthropology to human populations, convinced that the secrets of history could be measured from the body itself. One fashionable discipline was phrenology, which claimed that the shape of the skull and angles of the face revealed the person's place on the evolutionary ladder. In this strange new framework, the Irish became not simply neighbours, but subjects of racial classification. Victorian anthropologists attempted to distinguish Celtic Irish from the Anglo-Saxon English, and the conclusions were often troubling. Some writers portrayed the Irish as closer to earlier stages of human evolution, exaggerating their features in cartoons and pamphlets. The anthropologist John Beddoe, in The Races of Britain, attempted to measure these differences scientifically, placing Celtic populations lower within his racial hierarchy. Even flattering descriptions carried a darker edge. The Celt was said to be poetic, emotional, and imaginative, traits Victorian thinkers associated with immaturity rather than civilization. But these ideas did not stop within Britain. Across Europe, scholars were constructing racial taxonomies of their own, sometimes describing Atlantid race, a supposed blend of Nordic and Mediterranean ancestry said to inhabit Europe's Atlantic fringe. Ireland, Britain, and the western coast of Europe were often placed within this imagined category. Yet despite their confident language, these theories rested on fragile foundations. Their authors believed that by measuring skulls and physical traits, they could uncover the ancient origins of entire nations. And if the Irish could not be explained through myth or racial science, then perhaps their story could be found somewhere even older, in the pages of the Bible. Medieval scholars did not stop at the shores of Ireland. Going back to the Milesians, if they had arrived from Iberia, then a deeper question remained: where had they themselves come from? For Christian writers of the Middle Ages, the answer had to lie within the grand genealogy of the Bible. In the aforementioned Lebor Gabála Érenn, all mankind descends from Adam through the sons of Noah, with the peoples of Europe traced through Japheth and his descendant Magog, whom the text identifies as an ancestor of the Gaels. Through a chain of Scythian princes, Egyptian princesses, and wandering tribe, the story places the ancestors of the Irish firmly within the biblical history of the world. According to the tale, the Gaels descend from Goidel Glass, whose people travelled through Egypt during the time of the Exodus, before wandering the known world for centuries. Eventually, they settled in Iberia, where Brogan built a great tower at Brigantia, from which his son Eith first glimpsed Ireland across the sea. For medieval monks attempting to reconcile ancient Irish stories within Christianity, this explanation made perfect sense. Every nation had to fit somewhere within the story of the Bible. Centuries later, the biblical connection would be taken far more literally. In the 19th century, a movement known as British Israelism claimed that the peoples of Britain were not merely linked to biblical history, they were direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. According to its supporters, the wandering tribes had travelled from the Near East across Europe, becoming the Scythians and later the Saxons, before eventually settling in the British Isles. Some even claim that the British royal family descended from the house of King David, preserved through a legendary princess who travelled from the ancient kingdom of Judah to Ireland. For believers, this theory offered something irresistible: the idea that the history of Britain and Ireland was not only ancient, but divinely ordained. And these lads absolutely destroyed the Hill of Tara, in particular the Mound of the Nine Hostages, looking for the Ark of the Covenant, of all things, Indiana Jones job.
Those Protestants, up to no good as usual.
Yet the search for Irish origins would not end with scripture and prophecy. For others, the story of civilization itself began not in the Bible, but in the sands of ancient Egypt. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some scholars began searching even further afield for the origins of civilization itself. Theory known as Hyper-diffusionism proposed that many of the great achievements of ancient cultures had not arisen organically, but had spread outward from a single advanced civilization. For some anthropologists, that civilization was ancient Egypt. Writers such as Grafton Elliott Smith argued the similarities between monuments, religious practices, and burial customs across the world pointed to a common Egyptian origin carried abroad by ancient seafarers. To modern readers, the theory may seem extraordinary, but in an age shaped by empire and global exploration, it held a certain appeal. If Europe believed they were spreading civilization across the globe, it was not difficult to imagine that an earlier civilization had once done the same. Under this logic, echoes of Egypt could supposedly be found in distant cultures across the world, including along the Atlantic fringes of Europe. But Irish folklore itself offered a more mysterious possibility. For centuries, stories circulated of a strange island known as Hy-Brasil, said to lie somewhere west of Ireland. According to tradition, it was cloaked in mist, appearing only once every 7 years, before vanishing again beneath the sea. Medieval maps even marked the island beyond the coast of Galway, and expeditions from Bristol sailed in search of it during the 15th century. Sailors claimed to glimpse land through fog, while others spoke of forests, hills, and even strange inhabitants on the island. Yet while phantom islands and ancient civilizations captured the imagination, some scholars began to look for explanations much closer to home. And in doing so, they would stumble upon a theory that, though imperfect, pointed unexpectedly towards the real story of Irish origins. To understand this theory that contains a kernel of truth, we need to go back to the claim of Milesian origin from Spain in the Lebor Gabála Érenn. In the 2010s, a quiet revolution took place, a new kind of magic that allowed us to look directly into the material that made both us and our ancestors. With this genomic sequencing revolution, an old idea turned out to be closer to the truth than many had expected, but with a twist. Around 6,000 years ago, farmers of the Neolithic would arrive to Ireland. They are known as the early European farmers. These were the people who built monuments like Newgrange and venerated their ancestral dead within Great Passage tombs. A genetic study led by Laura Cassidy and colleagues at Trinity College Dublin in 2016 revealed something surprising. The DNA of these Neolithic Irish farmers shows stronger genetic drift with populations in Iberia than those in Central Europe, suggesting they may have reached Ireland along the Atlantic corridor rather than overland through central continental paths from their deeper origins in Anatolia and the Levant, vindicating the story of Iberian origins within an Irish population. But here is the twist. Modern Irish people inherit only a small direct genetic contribution from these Newgrange architects, as in the Bronze Age, a dramatic population turnover occurred, replacing up to 90% of the existent genetic ancestry. Archaeologists know this transformation as the Bell Beaker phenomenon, named after the distinctive drinking vessels found across Europe. These incoming people carried substantial steppe-related ancestry, ultimately tracing back to groups who had moved westward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, far to the east. So, the question remains, who are the real ancestors of the Irish? Well, the genetic evidence now shows that the ancestry of the Irish people formed from an early and stable blend of three prehistoric populations, that being the Western hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic period, the early European farmers of the Neolithic period, and steppe-derived peoples of the Bronze Age, a synthesis that had largely formed by around 2000 BC and remained broadly continuous thereafter. Though grandiose stories of escapism, biblical origins, and fantasy may capture the imagination, the genetic evidence is overwhelmingly clear. In truth, such legends are not needed. The story of our real ancestors is remarkable enough, and it is one we should be lamenting loudly.